And thank you for everyone who's here listening. Just before I start, I'm the one who's put together this particular webinar on planning, and I just wanted to just say that there'll be a few outputs. As Wim said, this will be publicly available for everyone, both on the CIB and UNISDR websites. And that the outputs, or this webinar is also contributing to a research roadmap that we're doing within CIB on hazards in the built environment, which will be presented at the CIB World Congress in Brisbane in next May. And also it's contributing to the first report of the UNISDR's Making Cities Resilient campaign, which is being done over the next few months. And will be launched at the World Urban Forum in Naples. And finally, we're organizing also at the World Urban Forum in Naples a session on challenges of urban planning for a disaster-resilient future, which is going to be held on the 4th of September, and that what the outputs from this will feed into that and to the elaboration of a collaborative research project on this topic. So if you're interested in any of these, please do get in touch. So what I'd like to talk about today is looking at the formal and the informal city and how planning regulations and planning is being implemented. This is a picture of Dhaka, which is in the foreground, the Korail district, which is an informal settlement in the quite a central area of the city in Dhaka in Bangladesh. And as you see, the more formally built city in the background. This is a city that has very high risk both to earthquakes and frequent flooding events. So there are lots of issues here. Just to give the overall background for this, I think one reason why planning, urban planning and disaster risk, I see them as important. One is that there is projections of urban growth, especially in low and middle income nations and especially in Asia. If you look at the third line down, the purple line in the graph, this is looking at urban growth, particularly in Asia. And the yellow line above that being urban growth in low and middle income nations. And therefore, as urban growth occurs, safe land on which to build and safe building practices are very important. For example, in Istanbul, it's estimated that 100,000 housing units per year are being added to the city, and we see many, many cities like that across the country, or across the world, that there's incredible amounts of building happening. There are many challenges regarding planning, and just to highlight here what this slide shows is that the UNISDR's Global Assessment Report, which came out in 2011, countries report on their progress in managing different areas of risk based on the Hyogo Framework for Action. And this diagram here shows what countries have reported in terms of progress on urban and land use planning, both in 2007, 2009, and 2009 to 2011. And what it shows very drastically is that lower middle and low income countries have not made significant progress on trying to implement urban and land use planning that accounts for disaster risk. So these are countries that are reporting high-level progress, that is significant achievements in incorporating planning and disaster risk. The Global Assessment Report also identifies that there are particular difficulties. One is developing appropriate urban plans that account for risk, so the incorporation of risk in urban planning. How to deal with existing vulnerable settlements, so vulnerable settlements that have been built up over time in our cities over many years, how to manage the risk there. How to enforce urban plans and also building codes when they have been developed. And fourthly, the political will to make risk reduction a priority within urban development and urban planning. So this is what the Global Assessment Report has identified as major issues in planning. Contributing to that report, I did a paper with a number of people who inputted on case studies, and this was one of, hundreds of background papers that were done for the Global Assessment Report. And this paper looked at creating an enabling environment for reducing disaster risk, and was based on 5 case studies, one on Istanbul in particular, another on Turkey more in general, third on Namibia, fourth on Argentina, and fifth on Iran. So over the next few minutes in this presentation, I'm going to draw on these case studies and this paper that I did as a contribution to the Global Assessment Report to bring out some of the issues in planning that I see. Not all of this paper was about planning. Some was about building codes and building standards, which I won't go into much detail on here, although they're linked. But basically, I see that there are 2 main issues that are interlinked. They're not they're not separate, but that there's urban planning to reduce the future risk in cities, that is, cities that are going to be cities as they are developing in the future, and urban planning to manage existing risk in cities. And so one is about planning for the future, and the other is about how do we deal with what we have now. In planning for the future, we need consideration of hazard risk areas, areas that are safe for development and areas that aren't safe, safe construction of buildings and infrastructure, and affordability and access for the poor into urban environments. Because what we're seeing more and more in this very strong land markets that we have in many cities is that the poor basically have no place in the city anymore. And are forced to live in very unsafe places because people want to live in the city and need to live in the city, so they are forced to live in very unsafe places, and this is creating a lot of risk. And then the second is to manage existing risk. How to manage existing developments in hazard-prone areas, informal settlements, how to deal with unsafe buildings and infrastructure. So I'm going to make 3 particular points here in this presentation. One is about multi-level risk governance and what is needed for that in terms of looking at planning. That's kind of a complex term, but I'll break it down into a few things that I see are important. How to develop access to safe and affordable land in urban areas, and I'll give a couple of examples of what's been done in other places that's interesting. And about managing risk in informal settlements, particularly how to reduce vulnerability there. So first of all, looking at multi-level governance, what the study that across these 5 case studies and also other literature that I've looked at have shown is one is the need for regional level coordination across metropolitan areas or across physical regions. For example, floodplain management of entire floodplains, and I'll go into that. Also the need for multiple stakeholders, and there's a lot of discussion about that, but we'll have actually a session on that tomorrow, more particularly, but that's really important for planning. Different departments, the private sector, and communities, and how everyone is integrated, particularly into the planning process. And seeing laws and planning as strategic rather than reactionary, and I'll give an example on that. And of course, the need for integration. Particularly if we look at this area in northern Namibia, which one of my colleagues had written a case study about flooding that happened there in 2009. A very, very serious flood that stayed over this whole north region of Namibia for many, many months. And they wrote about about how people have coped with the floods. But one of the areas is that there's one of the things that came up in this case, and we see a similar thing, for example, in Bangkok, is that there's very much a need for regional flood management. For example, these 2 towns, Odangwa and Oshakati, have had plans for managing the flood in their own areas, but nothing to deal with the whole floodplain. As you can see in the map, it's a whole floodplain region. And in fact, Odangwa actually had created a drainage channel that actually increased flooding in another village. And this is very, very common, for example, also in Bangkok, where the flooding in the north of Bangkok exacerbated because trying to control the floodwaters coming into Bangkok, into the city. Another example of the need for having a more strategic approach to laws and planning comes from Buenos Aires, the province of Buenos Aires in Argentina, where a number of laws were created over time in reaction to floods that happened in 1957 and in 1977, regulations about the production of urban plots. Quite strict regulations about how far they had places had to be away from streams and canals, and this is very prescriptive type of zoning regulations and land use development regulations, and the size of plots, etc. And what happened with this was this made the cost of urban land very, very high, and that many people could no longer afford to buy land within the province, and that this put people into having to live informally rather than being able to purchase land. So there was a lot of issues with regards to informally developed areas that came out of these kind of laws, which has an implication on risk. Secondly, moving on to look at access to safe and affordable land in urban areas. I think there's really a need for innovative solutions in to recognize the inequality in access to urban land, the need for flexibility in land tenure arrangements, and the possibilities of communal ownership. Another example from Namibia that has come up both in the literature and in the case study was in Windhoek, which is the capital, and there's a very innovative program that was developed in conjunction with the municipality and the Shack Dwellers International and the local communities there represented by Shack Dwellers to change the ownership structure for land so that people could actually buy either hold very small plots of land so that people could actually afford to buy them, or there could be communal ownership on plots of land. And this has made it possible that people are able to access land in a much more secure way, having security of tenure and formal ownership, which allows them to regulate the type of development and the place where people are living, etc. In this particular situation, there was no value placed on the land, and the municipality was interested only in cost recovery. So this isn't necessarily indicative of what other cities can do, where landowners, municipalities, Crown property is seeking to make money off of the land. In looking at managing risk in informal settlements, there's a number of issues that are coming up in cities across the world, and I'll deal with it very, very briefly here, but I think this is something that really requires more research and more action on. This is the location of people are living in hazard-prone areas because they don't have access to safer areas within the city, living on floodplains, living on steep slopes, areas prone to landslides, etc. There's a lot of construction that's very high risk. Of course, doing anything about this is a very politically sensitive issue. And yet evictions and the idea of relocation can very negatively affect the urban poor having to move and the vulnerability that's created from that. Another example from Namibia. I do have other examples, but this was one of the communities that was affected by the flood. They actually had come across this master plan for the city, which is basically will mean that their community will be relocated to the outskirts of the city. And this is very much against what the community wants to do, but that the area is going to be developed for higher rent uses, and therefore they can make it actually flood-proof. So this is just an indicative example of something that's happening in many, many cities across the world. And maybe I'll skip that just for time's sake, but just to say that I think that in terms of the way people can actually build to cope with that, Actually, maybe I'll go quickly back here. Just to say that in Bangladesh, for example, there's a national building code, but the way that people are building the way people can build, but given the land that they have available and the resources that they have available, doesn't necessarily match the building code. And so there needs to be a revision of all of these type of codes in order to build, and so there can be some sort of regulation and some sort of stipulations about what is safe and what is unsafe building. For example, in one of these small rooms here, in one of these houses, a whole family is living, and these actually aren't even on land, but are actually over the water. But yet people are making very interesting changes to their house. Like this drawing shows, for example, and this is in Korail, the houses can be raised or lowered depending on what the flood levels are going to be. And this is understanding from 1 year in to 1 year out how high the flood water comes. And so there is ways of managing risk in informal settlements, even with or without regulations, but people doing this through their own coping. I won't go into too much detail about what's happening in Turkey because I think we have another speaker about that. But just to say, in Istanbul, there's a huge amount of the city has been developed informally in a city that has a very high risk of earthquakes. This orange shows the the informal settlements in the city. Yet there's a number of state-led mass housing projects that are being developed. So very high-density mass housing, trying to deal with the risk that's been developed through the informal settlements, because many of these informal settlements have developed to quite high density in areas that are quite high risk for earthquakes. So there's a lot of potential damage that could happen there. So one of the approaches is a state-led mass housing projects to try to deal with these risks. However, this is leading to a quite large displacement of people across the city. This shows the area is designated as regeneration projects in which people will not be able to stay in their area and will likely be evicted from there. And for example, there's two examples. I have one in Sanjaktepe, which is on the Asian side, quite sort of far out of the urban area, although becoming more urbanized all the time. One area that's deemed to be risk for flooding, in which the areas 100 meters of the river are to be removed. Yet this is very much against what people want, people who've settled there for many years. And they say that there isn't a flooding problem in the area. And another area in Karadolap in Istanbul, which is a designated area of regeneration in which this informal settlement is to be removed and replaced with mass housing that will be much safer for earthquakes. Yet the issue is that most of the people who are living there will not be able to afford the new housing that's built there and will thus be resettled on the outskirts of the city. So there's a lot of organization against these type of regeneration projects in Istanbul. And just to give one more example of a different approach to how to deal with informal settlements to what the approach I just mentioned, the Community Organizations Development Institute in Thailand has had for several years called the Ban Mong Kong Collective Housing Program. And the idea is for people who are living in informal settlements to form community savings groups that are then, once a level of savings is achieved, are supported by CODI for infrastructure and given loans to redevelop the areas and also help to find land either nearby or negotiating for land in the particular area. So it's a very collective approach to housing.
Cassidy, you
yes.
In 2 minutes? Okay, thank you.
Okay. That can potentially have and if this type of thing is scaled up, which is the idea that they're working on in Thailand, is that can potentially give much more secure access to land. And also there's been a new building code that's been developed for these type of housing developments, particularly to allow them to have less setback from the road, closer to each other, etc. That makes it less expensive. And so these kind of things all allow to increase resilience in informally settled areas. For example, areas that are at high risk of flooding that can be built up, as you see in this photo here. So just to close, a couple of closing remarks. I think that even in high risk areas, planning is still not well integrated with risk management, and this requires, from what I see in the cities, this requires training of planners. It requires more technical knowledge about how to do it, and also better information about risk, particularly about what are the potential for future events, and the need for regional level coordination in flood-prone areas. And this is not always easy because of political issues. I'll say that. And I think even places that suffer from frequent events, people don't necessarily think they can do anything about it, and tend to see things as managing the event when it comes. And what we're talking about here, talking about planning, is really about forethought, and this takes strong political commitment. I just came back from Bangkok, and there's a lot of, they had a very large flood last year, but there's still the thought that, that was a one-off type of event, and that it won't necessarily happen for many years in the future. Therefore, we don't need to necessarily change what we're doing. And I think, thirdly, there are innovative solutions about how to upgrade high-risk urban settlements, but more research is needed to make these practices more widespread. Upgrading of high-risk urban settlements is very time and resource intensive. Sort of mass housing approaches like what's happening in Turkey are probably more cost-effective. But I think in terms of what you have as an end result of a socially just city, it's not in many cities not a very beneficial way. So other things are needed, other approaches are needed. And I think more research, just a general statement, is that more research is needed to understand what municipalities' needs are for improving planning, and advocacy is very important in this. Just to say that more research is needed in this area. So I'll leave it there, and I look forward to your comments and questions, and I shall try to pass this back to Wim.